One truth can break a foundation as though it were made of glass. One truth can create a new vision, a future not haunted by the past. The ghosts that haunt us will be laid to rest. The struggle is our test. It is our test. We are the West. We are the West. We are the West. One sound can awaken our senses, remove this veil of black. One tune can lift up our spirits, a story that was made to last. The ghosts that haunt us will be laid to rest. The struggle is our test. It is our test. We are the West. We are the West. We are the West. This time we won't believe what they tell us. The lies are burned to ash. This time we'll defend our borders from all of those who were never gonna ask. The ghosts that haunt us will be laid to rest. The struggle is our test. It is our test. We are the West. We are the West. We are the West.
And good afternoon, everyone. We're having a bit of a special for you guys today with an interview with Mike from Imperium Press with the release of Folktales from the Indo-European Tradition. So welcome, everyone. I hope everyone is having a wonderful new year and yeah, what can I say? Best of luck in 2022 or something.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Best of luck for this year. We will see how it develops. Will it be
Yeah.
better or worse than 2021? We don't know. Well, yes, not our usual streaming time today, but we are talking to Mike, who is all the way over in Australia, and we are very, very pleased to have him on the show. How are you doing, Mike?
Yeah, I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me, and thank you for moving your regular schedule around to accommodate me. It really, really helps. So thank you.
No, we appreciate
problem. We're really happy to
multiple time zones.
Yeah, we're really happy to
Yeah.
have you on. I think we'll have a very interesting discussion. So definitely our honor to have you here.
So, Mike, would you like to tell people, although I'm sure most people do have some idea, about what Imperium Press does? What are you usually up to?
So, the mandate of Imperium Press has kind of changed over time, but we are still basically what we started out as, which is a publisher of classics. But we also do contemporary authors as well. We've had a number of releases by living authors in our scene, in the nationalist right wing scene, dissident scene. Um, but yeah, much of what we do involves publishing people who have been dead for hundreds of years and sometimes thousands of years. So yeah, what we call ourselves the classics department of the right. We started out calling
Yeah.
ourselves the classics department of the dissident right, but I don't really like the term dissident right anymore. We are just the right. So we're the classics department of that.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's, yeah, in a nutshell, kind of what we're all about.
Nice. And I've certainly read some of your titles. I'm currently digging into polemos on pagan traditionalism. So that's pretty cool. And I've a lot of people I know have read The Ancient City. I need to get into that. And there's a whole bunch of wonderful Imperium Press titles out there. But today we are here to talk about one in particular, and that is the folktale book, which is a little bit of a diversion from what Imperium Press usually does, but arguably not quite so much. What sort of made you think that you wanted to do the folktale book?
Well, this thing actually kind of goes to the very beginnings of the company itself. Um, Originally, well, it's the Imperium Press kind of had like sort of two births, so to speak, or two things that kind of set off a chain of events that led to its beginning. One of those, which I won't dwell on too much, is that I just read a lot of um, I read a lot of books from the university publishers like Cambridge University Press and Oxford and Princeton University Press. I read a lot of these editions of important thinkers that were liberal and that I wasn't satisfied with. So I thought that we could do better. And basically, that's one of the main things that we've done is sort of try to usurp that that space from these people because they don't respect people like Joseph de Maistre or Robert Filmer or even like Fustel de Coulanges and all these. And there's a lot more ground we have yet to cover. So that was one of the reasons why we started the company. But the other sort of like earlier um, impetus for it was that I was putting together this book of folk tales for my kids. And it started off very, very modestly. Um, it just basically sort of started off where um, I was just kind of looking around just for some, wholesome folk tales that I could put together for them. And then I
Yeah.
came upon this study by uh, a couple of academics by the name of Silva and Terrani. Um, and I decided to choose a couple of tale types from that study. Um, should I explain it? Maybe I'll explain it just very, very briefly for the audience because
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Go ahead.
it's key to the sort of structure of the book itself. So I discovered this study in the very early stages of putting together this book that it was only supposed to be, maybe a dozen or 2 dozen folk tales. And the study basically explains that many folk tales, which have been thought um, in recent academia to be something like, just a few hundred years old, are far older than that. In fact, they're older than most of our myths, and um, older than the Bible and things like that. And that this made international news. I remember hearing about this because I read it on the Guardian. So it was like, this doesn't happen very often, that folkloristics makes front page news. So it was a really big study, and
Mm.
basically, um, what it does is it takes 50 tale types, which we can get into what those are later, and traces them back to how far back in the Indo-European migrations they can be traced. And some of them go right back to the Proto-Indo-European. So we're talking about, 5, 6,000 years ago, which is remarkable. And many others are,
Wow.
not that far behind. We're talking like, 3, 4,000 years ago. So a lot of folk tales are very, very ancient, and this really it kind of grabbed hold of me and so made me sit up and take notice. So I started to kind of take this book that I was making for my kids, and it's still like the final product is still really for them. Um, and I started to kind of shape it where I would take these ancient tale types, and decided to get like 3 samples of each of the tail types, just so you could kind of get a feel for, if you have like one, it's like, it might not be a representative sample. 2 is kind of like, okay, that's a bit better, but 3 is where you start to get to notice patterns. So I put in 3 of each, and I just chose, because there's 50 of these tail types, and I just chose the tail types that interested me the most. And then I just kept going with it, and it just kind of became an obsession, and I just
Mm.
kept, adding more and more of the tail types. And believe me, it was not easy to find 3 tail types for each of these 50. So it really took a lot of digging, and hundreds of hours of like my own effort went into this. Well, yeah, probably about 100 hours in the end, and most of it just Googling. So yeah, that was kind of the genesis of it. Um, a lot of these like tales are not available in English, so I actually had to eventually commission some specially for translation, and one I actually have retold myself in this book. So yeah, I mean, the thing went through the endless revisions. I was looking something up just before we put out the final product, and I saw that I was working on this thing back in 2017. So that tells you how long it was in the works. So that's kind of where it all came from.
Yeah. I think me and Lynx can definitely relate to the falling down the rabbit hole of ATU types
Oh
and,
yeah.
oh yeah, all of these different collections and deciding how to categorize things. I mean, we have, uh, you especially, Lynx, haven't you? You've done some translating, a lot of translating of tales from Norwegian.
Yeah, I do prefer to do my own translations. I don't claim to be a wonderful storyteller or anything, but it's fun for one, and also any issues with copyright or anything like that you don't have to worry about, because some of the tales are a bit hard to find in open source translation.
Exactly.
You can find some, but not all of them. Quite a few times. So
Yeah.
yeah, but getting a grip on all of the stories, yeah, that's definitely
Mm.
quite
Oh yeah.
difficult. Trying to find the theme and everything, because so many of the
And
stories include so much.
yeah, some of them don't make sense unless you take them as highly metaphorical. And we're glad to see, definitely, this taking of folklore and having a really serious look at it, because that is exactly what we thought was lacking in right wing analysis of culture when we started up this stream. So it's very, very cool. to see this, and that sort of leads me on to another one of the questions I have to ask you today, which is why do you think academically that folklore has not really been taken seriously? That there's been this sort of snobby attitude to it, when, as you've stated, we've found out that it's older than some of the myths, that it's very ancient, and it could really give us some good insight into history. Why do you think it's been treated in this way?
Sorry, I was just popping a link in the chat there so that the audience.
I can see the study. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I put it in the private chat. You have to stick it on YouTube, but there's the
Shall.
link for the study of that we've been talking about. But yeah, no, that's a good question. Why do academics have this snobby attitude towards folk tales and fairy stories and folk culture in general? I mean, I think that on the one hand, uh, it's because academics are distrustful of anything like common sense or traditional wisdom, and it's natural that they would be distrustful of that because there really isn't anything for them to do if we just kind of defer to the wisdom of the folk, right? Like they're there because sometimes traditional wisdom needs a little bit of help. At least that's what they should be there for. They should really be there as a supplementary. They should serve a supplementary purpose. When in
Hmm.
what turns out is that they have really tried to take over for it. But so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I mean, they don't see that the folk tale is hopelessly entangled with myth. If they did, then they might see it as more worthy of respect because I think studies of in mythology and classics and things like that, they certainly do. They're kind of like um, sequestered into this sort of dusty little corner of academia, but a classicist is still considered a serious scholar, right? And the classics are still considered a serious kind of field of study. Um, but that's because they are seen as high culture. But one of the things I wanted to get across in the introduction to the book is that high culture, that folktale and folk culture is sort of like interwoven with high culture, and that you cannot disentangle at the end of the day folktale, folk culture, legend, and myth. These things are all kind of like just all enmeshed together. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, I think that they kind of don't see that, and I like to punch academics a little bit. That's kind of like part of what Imperium Press is all about. But there are some like sensible and respectful academics. But you know what? There's a reason
Mm.
why this area has been kind of colonized by a sort of like hyper progressive that loves novelty for novelty's sake. And I think that, and sadly, at the end of the day, they don't like folk tales because they kind of think they smell old and musty, and that there's not really that much more to it than that, to be honest.
Yeah.
There is sort of an insight to this in one of the Norwegian folk tales, actually. It might be more of given a scenario with older bits and pieces, I think. I think, I don't remember if it was Asbjørnsen or if it was Mo who did sort of write their own stories based on local legends and everything. And I did some excerpts from that, our first Halloween stream. And that tales includes, because it happens on a mill outside of Christiania, now Oslo. And it takes up old legends from mills. And the texts do go into how people from the countryside are sort of looked down on, because now we're so modern and mature, So, all of these old stories and legends, they're just for the country people. They're not educated and not rational and all of that. So you can definitely trace that way of thinking back at least close to 200 years now.
Yeah, and there is a sense part of it is just the historical the portion of the historical cycle that we're in. Usually when cultures are kind of on the decline, you start to see that like the city absorbs all culture, and there isn't really anything sort of outside of that. And that's kind of where we are right now. You could contrast this even with maybe 2 generations ago or so, when something like in America at least, country music was very much more in vogue. And I don't mean the sort of like slick like Mick country music that you see on whatever music channel they have on TV now, but I mean the kind of thing that would be like you know um, you see like Cleveland's Clearwater Revival and the band and things like that. That kind of thing was a lot more popular back then. Basically, Southern
Yeah.
rural culture was a lot more popular back then. And that was, even though, the 1960s were not exactly the healthiest point in Western culture, it was still a healthier time than now. But now that kind of thing is just relegated. It's just ridiculed, basically. So yeah, part of it is just that the cities kind of absorb everything, and this is something that like Spengler himself goes into in a fair bit of depth in his book in the Decline of the West, saying that this is exactly what sort of happens at this sort of period of the like autumn to winter into the winter
Yeah.
period, that the cities kind of tend to dominate and swallow up everything. And that's also part of why academia looks down on folk culture, because it kind of forgets that like folk culture is the soil out of which it grows, even at a remove of like many centuries, where basically we've gone through, like, even liberalism itself has gone through all these convolutions, where we've gone through mass democracy, or revolutionary liberalism, to bourgeois liberalism, to mass democracy, to wokeism. People kind of forget that some of that, even that kind of like ultimately derives from the folk culture. And yeah, when you kind of forget where you come from, this is the kind of trouble that you run into.
Absolutely. And I think there are two reasons uh, that I can think of why there's this sort of rural, anti-rural, anti-folk culture snobbery. I guess because the folk tales and the folk culture, number one, remind academics today of things that are inconvenient to various theories they've cooked up. They remind people of natural gender dynamics. They have morals about not trusting strangers. They have very black and white morality, which nobody really thinks is fashionable these days. And I guess another reason why folk culture is looked down upon is because specifically it has historically had connections to national identity and nationalism. Literally. As in the Romantic nationalists. Which is something I think you mention in the foreword of your book as well. Isn't it, Mike?
Yeah, Romantic nationalism was an important part of the the revival of folk tales. And I mean, I think it's worth giving a little bit of historical context around that, because it's just so important. Well, it's kind of the beginning of where the introduction goes in the book, but it's also sort of the beginning of this revival of folk culture. And I think also it's a revival of the archaic European spirit as well, that you see sort of coming back, even the archaic Indo-European spirit that you see coming back from time to time throughout European history, especially in the Renaissance, but even more so in this Romantic nationalist period. So, folk tales have, I mean, they've been collected since at least the 17th century. You guys obviously are very familiar with Battista Basile's Pentamerone. Um, but it wasn't until that period, like the Romantic period of the sort of like late 18th and up to the mid 19th century, that this sort of collection and interest in folklore really picked up in earnest. So Romanticism was kind of like a reaction against liberalism. I mean, it's typically taken to be kind of an outgrowth of liberalism, but I see it as a countercurrent that sort of moved against liberalism and sort of focused its ire on liberalism's abstract tendencies. So in the Enlightenment, which is, as far as I'm concerned, sort of the high point of like liberalism, you had someone like Immanuel Kant, whose metaphysical project was involved, uh, you know, deducing the categories of reason. So his goal basically was to determine the structure of human experience without any recourse to the particularities of time and place. So, in other words, he kind of wanted to exclude culture. And what Romanticism did, I mean, among other things that it
Mm.
did, one of the most important things that it did was to come in and say, like, wait a minute, hold on. Time and place are really actually everything when it comes to who you are and how you view the world. And you can see this echoed much later in someone like Heidegger. So, in response to Kant, Johann Georg Hamann says, no, in fact, just the fact that you're thrown into a Christian world and in the habit of using Greek terms like a priori and a posteriori, all these technical terms, this all these givens, all these things that you didn't choose, all these things that are particular and concrete and unchosen, all these things completely color your view of reality, these cultural backgrounds. So language and culture actually determine everything in our as regards our worldview. This is not something that we can ever escape. Not even that we can't fully escape it. We can't escape it at all. So this gives you a bit of a background on the kind of debates that were going on at the time. And so into this romantic era, like school of thought, step the Grimm brothers. And these guys were, everybody knows the name, uh, but these guys were professionally trained linguists who studied under a very important legal thinker named Friedrich Karl von Savigny. And his big idea was that law is not the product of like abstract reason or the will of the prince or whatever, but it's the product of what is called in German the Volksgeist, which is, I think, literally it's actually the folk spirit, but it's kind of close to what we mean in English when we say the folk soul. So the Grimms, um, they got hold of this idea of the Volksgeist, and then they kind of went looking for it in their own folklore, and they found it. They found a huge store of it, and they were actually among the first to really sort of track these things down thoroughly and systematically. And of course, their book, Children's and Household Tales, was this massive success, and it kicked off a revolution in folklore studies. Soon you had people doing the same thing in pretty much every society in Europe, to where, I think that came out in 1814 or something, first volume, first edition. And then, like, about 100 years later, you could find a major compilation of folk tales from just about every European culture. So they really inaugurated a revolution in this sense, but they were part of a like much wider kind of cultural zeitgeist that was going on at the time. So this is something that I think actually Romantic nationalism itself is kind of like one of the main progenitors of us today. This is kind of like what we are doing is kind of carrying that on. And so this is kind of why I thought, well, among many other reasons, one of the reasons why I thought it was important to kind of recast folk culture as generative of our thing and why it's important to us.
No, yeah, that totally makes sense. How the nature of folklore in itself is a great proof against this whole conception that everyone's this solitary individual who makes decisions independent of time and place and culture, and we all came together and rationally decided to live how we live, and therefore it could change at any time. Like, the stories here are deeply embedded within us, within the Volksgeist, and we resonate with them on the level of our blood.
Yeah. I was browsing in an online shop for books, and I clicked on the folklore tab, and there was actually, well, no, the first books on there were literally in the description was because the Austrian painter whose name cannot be mentioned. Therefore, we have to basically extinguish the flame of folktales and that basic structure for the people, literally, because it's evil. The national romanticism came at a very interesting point in Norwegian history, because we had just freed ourselves from Denmark after 400 years. Then we were 100 years under Sweden. So that whole era in Norway was really infused with establishing ourselves again, fully as an independent people and everything. So it was very strong in Norway, and it still is, actually.
Yeah, actually, I think one of the I try to think back, because people always ask me, like, how did you get to where you are and everything and your journey? And of course, there are many answers to that question, but one of them that, like, sometimes I think about is that I think one of the things that led me towards like a more nationalist perspective is just the aesthetics. Uh, I think people are moved by aesthetics more than by reason. I mean, to a degree that's just like it's not even close. And one of the things that really moved me in that direction was getting into 19th century classical music, but particularly romantic nationalist classical music. So some of the composers that I loved as a teenager were people
Uh-huh.
like, of course, Wagner,
Yep.
but also lesser known uh, composers as well. One of my favorites is Modest Mussorgsky, uh, of the
I
Russian Five. He's the one that did Night on Bald Mountain. That's the one everybody knows. But he also did a wonderful suite called Pictures at an Exhibition, which is my favorite of his. But
It's a
one of the
nice,
best
nice
of
piece.
yeah, oh yeah, I love it. And one of the best and most moving for me ever was Edvard Grieg's Peer Gynt's suite. And I just remember as a teenager on sort of like Halloween or around that time of year, just listening to the Peer Gynt suite and just like letting the that's a very wonderful time of year because you can feel the liminality, the sort of like the line between the living and the dead being blurred. You can feel that if you have any sensitivity towards these things, that time of year brings that out
Mm.
very, very closely. And I remember listening to Anitra's dance, especially, but the whole suite, um, and just like really feeling that sort of inexpressible something that I could really it's sort of like I'm not Norwegian myself, but I am from descent. Ultimately, come from a Germanic background,
Hmm.
and you can feel that. You can just you can feel a kindred spirit sort of welling up from that. And yeah, the nationalist composer Grieg was really formative for me in that sense. And of course, there's no ideological content to that at all. But there was something in the air in that time and place. The 19th century, I regard that as the sort of high point of the West, really, because of this. And it was obviously a high point intellectually as well as aesthetically. But yeah, I love hearing about the sort of like nationalist struggles and movements and currents in all the different parts of Europe and all the different places, because we in the Anglosphere don't know, well, especially in the sort of I'm Canadian by birth, but like in the sort of Canadian American kind of milieu, we don't know a whole lot about about the Scandinavian countries, and in a sense, we sort of regard them as like a monolithic block, and you don't think too much about the idea of Norway being under the boot of Denmark for 400 years, right? So it's wonderful to kind of hear about these movements and struggles and everything, and yeah, you can see that the move from the mid 19th century to, well, let's just say the mid 20th century, something very special was happening at that time in terms of the awakening of something that had to be tamped down very, very, very quickly, but is rising again. So, yeah.
I mean, I get you there with the aesthetics of the Romantic period of classical music. I was always very, very into Rachmaninoff and composers around the same time. I believe Tchaikovsky was also Romantic era. And I really, really, really love the dramaticness of that era, the epicness, the heroicness. And recently I've been watching a lot of Wagner operas as well. They are just epically heroic. And I've always had a natural attraction to those sort of aesthetics. And so I feel that makes sense, yes. That's what kind of was there, the seed, really, for my attraction into nationalism. So I agree with you on that front about the 19th century and the Romantic period being a very special time for art.
Yeah, when you go into yourself, if you're in a state of rootlessness, which I was a few years back, for me, I had to go back to my roots. And when you hit that piece inside you, that link to your people, your ancestors, it really touches something very deep inside you. It is very strong. And, it sort of gives you a place in the world. Even if you don't live where you grew up and all of that, it sort of gives you a basis in the universe, so to speak. And a deeper connection to your people. And definitely what they're trying to snuff out these days. There was that time in the 1800s, which then came back in the 30s. I'm not quite sure when it happened, but it was definitely a part of what was going on. But I also am of the opinion that it came back in the 60s. And it was definitely tried very hard to redirect, which unfortunately they were able to do. But part of that I definitely think was the innate instinct in finding who you are and where you belong in the world. And that will inevitably lead you to searching for your roots. And I do think we're seeing more of that now. it might be a wave that's very slowly building, but it is building. And that is one reason why I think it's very important that we keep our link to our roots. We explore it, we look into it, and establish that. As Katrina mentioned earlier, we thought it was a lack of that in the scene, which was one reason why we started up our channel. And this isn't a criticizing anyone else, but when you look at the culture scene of the right, it really is a focus on Hollywood, going back a few years to the more pre-woke area and everything. But is that really what we should look back to? That just led to where we are today. So I definitely think we need to also look at what came before that.
Absolutely. I mean, there's evidence of a demand for it out there because people they're sort of craving for authenticity for stuff based around folk culture, which is why they're sort of lapping up sort of tribally influenced Anglo-Saxon Norse influenced music, why they're strongly responding to folk music and even, Anglo-Saxon memes for Norse and Celtic teens groups on Facebook. There's a hunger for it. There's a hunger for having roots that people don't quite know how to fulfill.
Yeah, definitely. It's a kind of universal human need, and it's the one thing, because I think liberalism is, like, it can be characterized in many ways. If you want to take it at its own word, it really is just about a kind of freedom. But I think it's important for us, not to sort of hack on freedom too much here, but I think it's important to kind of oppose to freedom, especially the kind of freedom that liberalism wants, the idea of heritage. Because really, what heritage is it's all the stuff that you didn't choose, right? Uh, the most unchosen thing of all is really the past. You didn't choose the sort of biological characteristics that you have. You didn't choose where you were born. You didn't choose the language that you speak, at least that you grew up with. But the one thing, I mean, you can kind of change those things. I mean, if transhumanism has its way, you'll be able to change your biological characteristics. You can certainly move somewhere else. You can change what language you speak. You can reinvent yourself as a different person. The one thing that you cannot change ever is the past. And it's this what liberalism hates the most is the things that you can't change, and the past being sort of paradigmatic of that's really the ultimate enemy for liberalism. Sometimes I sort of characterize it as the memento view of history, that, like, movie Memento, where the guy has amnesia and he can't make new memories, and he just keeps getting the reset button hit every 15 minutes. To me, that's a very powerful metaphor for the modern world, actually,
Yeah.
where it refuses to kind of come to grips with anything that happened more than 15 minutes ago, because that was problematic or oppressive,
Yes.
or whatever they want to say about it. So it's really the past is kind of the enemy, which is why you get this decolonize your bookshelf kind of calls to decolonize your thinking and your bookshelf and all these things. Because what that ultimately means is just don't
Mm.
take seriously anything that didn't happen like yesterday. So that leaves people feeling very rootless, and rootless people become desperate because it's very uncomfortable. It's excruciating and intolerable, really. Rootless people become very, very desperate, especially when they have a strong need for those roots. And so, what the modern world has done is it's created all these people who are desperate in that way. And so, basically, what they've done is they've created us. They've created a movement that is so very strongly ideologically and in principle opposed to it that uh, there had to be this counter reaction to it. So yeah, that's one of the things that we're trying to do as a publishing company is to reclaim the past. I mean, it's not Brody Midyard says, I think this is a good way of putting it, that tradition isn't about turning the world into a museum. It's a living thing that evolves, of course. So you don't want to sort of like worship the past just as a kind of like dead husk, but at the same time, it really is the kind of wellspring of everything that we have and everything that we will be in the future. So that's what we're doing. That's what you guys are doing with your podcast, and I think that we could never have
Mm.
too much of that in our sphere.
Yeah. I mean, tradition is definitely not a static thing. Like, it doesn't matter if your Yule log tradition evolves into lighted candles, as long as you have some sense of continuity and some way of continuing the symbolism around that time. But yeah, like, to throw out all the tradition leaves people basically floundering in kind of a meaningless void, because, you know, being rootless, what does a tree do if it doesn't have roots? Falls over. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. People don't have roots, people don't have meanings. And so, yeah, it's leading them into a very sad place. A place where they hate their own culture because they don't think there's anything to it. A place where they want to go borrowing other people's cultures to find meaning and identity, which I see a lot. And so basically we have to reestablish our roots
Yeah,
for the good of
absolutely.
our own selves as well as our society. We're just not designed to live without them.
I like the way that Stephen, forget his last name. This is embarrassing. The guy who created the True Folk Assembly,
McNullen.
Stephen McNallen. Yes. How could I forget? I like the way that he puts it. That you have to drink from your own well. That this is, and to bring it back to sort of the discussion at hand, of like specifically about folk culture and folk tales. This is what you have to do. You have to kind of go back to your roots. You have to go back to your folk culture, to where you are from, and to drink from your own well. And this is why we tried to put in such a wide swath of folk tales from so many different European cultures into our book to represent a wide cross section of those cultures. That you have to really go back to your own roots, and that this is the sort of only authentic way to do things. To import all the most deep and abiding values from another culture is just to create something that's kind of monstrous. Like, when I was sort of casting about as a kind of rootless libertarian, I hit upon a wonderful and beautiful and venerable tradition that was Taoism, actually. And I still have a lot of respect for it. I've sort of made a break from it, not just because it's not my own culture, but because in some sense fundamentally disagree with it. But that's what kind of what I was reduced to as that kind of thinking is to looking that far afield from for what I valued the most, and feeling like that's I could find it there, which is not a good thing, right? So yeah, this is I think that he puts it well when he says you have to drink from your own well, and this is something that we have to
Mhm.
sort of bring ourselves back
Mm.
to.
So, someone in the chat called Judge Holden is asking if you're familiar with the work of Thomas Taylor, who was a British classicist, and Walter Otto, who was a German philologist.
Otto, is that he? There's quite a few Germans named Otto,
Yeah, there's quite a lot
um,
of them.
but he might be, if I have him pegged right, he might be someone who has had like a sort of formative influence on Spengler with the kind of idea of cyclical history. But I'm not, if that's even the same person, I'm not
Mm.
that familiar. And Thomas Taylor doesn't ring a bell at all. So yeah.
Okay, maybe Judge Holden, you can give an overview of what those figures basically did
Otto
in the
wrote
chat.
Dionysus Cult and Mythos, says Judge Holden.
Okay.
That does sound interesting, so might have to take a look on it. I do find it very
Yes.
interesting how a lot of folklore on YouTube and everything is actually done by leftists. So
Yeah.
there
I
definitely
mean, a lot of
seems to be
leftists are pagans as well.
yeah.
A lot of
What's about to
and
say
they
that? So
they sort of have an attraction towards it
yeah,
sometimes.
but then they have to form it in a universal way in their minds. Like I was taking a look at the runes this autumn, and when I looked up Otala, which is basically ancestral heritage, that meant
Yes.
that all of the people all over the world are your family because we're all one.
No. Not the
Literally
meaning of Othala.
going exactly in the opposite direction of what it actually means.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of thing is a very superficial reading of folk culture, because what folk culture is fundamentally is something very much particularist.
Mm-hmm.
It's the expression of a people in a particular time and place. Not so much time, because I think people's don't change very quickly, if they change at all. But uh, certainly particular to a place, and a, a, a biome, or like the soil and that sort of thing. It's basically what folk culture is it's sort
Mm.
of like a particularist um, expression of the soul of a people. And so to kind of like say, oh, well, folk culture is just kind of this nebulous thing that like is an expression of like universal human desires and everything, or values, is just it's just to kind of not understand it at all. Because what particularism says is that it's actually the things that we don't share that are
Mm.
the most important. The things that animate you, and that are the deepest values that you hold, are the things that are not shared with everyone. And vice versa. That it's the things that we all share, and we do all share some things as human beings. I mean, it is a coherent category. We can all agree that you shouldn't light babies on fire. That's probably a pretty good rule of thumb. But it's not
Can all
much.
of us agree?
Well, let's just assume. uh, but it's not
I'm
much.
sure there's some tribe in a jungle somewhere that doesn't agree.
Yeah. But
Probably.
I'm sure that like if you thought really hard, you could come up with something that like even a like Sentinelese tribesman can agree with, a Russian Orthodox priest on, but it's not going to be enough to build a robust, society or morality out of, right? Like it's the things that we share with everyone are the most trivial things, and the things that we share just with our family and our tribe and our people are the things that matter the most. So to me, this is something that is so obvious that it barely even needs to be justified.
Yeah, I know.
And it really is just the sort of root and like pith of what folk culture is all about. So when
Mm.
people kind of come in and say, well, folk culture is just the things that we all share, well, take away all the stuff that we don't share, and what you're left with is pretty impoverished.
Yes, pretty much. Like, for example, the folk tales of uh, Europe and India bear quite some relation to one another, but you would compare the folk tales of Europe with the folk tales of Africa or the folk tales of China, you're not really finding much in common. Certain things will always be in common because there are certain things that exist throughout the world. That doesn't mean that's all folk culture is. Just this expression of something totally universal. Because obviously we have totally different environments, totally different ways of life. And so it can't be. It just logically can't be.
Yeah, like there doesn't seem to be any serious explanation for how it is that there can be these universal human sort of expressions or paradigms of, that express themselves so deeply in folklore that are, these people are identifying, like the universalists are identifying. Like, how did this come to be? Well, it certainly didn't come to be from borrowing or genetically. Like, I mean, you can see some borrowing between Europe and Africa. Like, one of the examples I give in the introduction to the Folktales book is that there is a very old Egyptian story that is very close to an ATU tale type that originated, if I'm correct, in the Proto-Balto-Slavic migrations. So there you go. There is one thing that is shared between a certain part of Africa and much of Europe,
Mm-hmm.
but it was clearly something that was borrowed one way or the other. Um,
Yep.
so that there's an explanation, but something that was shared between a Middle Eastern you know tribal Sabian or something like that with an Aztec. How do you explain that? Well, there has to be some sort of like very soft-headed, nebulous hundredth monkey explanation that it's just sort of a
Mm.
spontaneous expression of like the human whatever. And this kind of thing would not pass muster in a serious folkloristics department. Um, so
No.
yeah, I mean these people who believe that and I can't speak from experience having watched them, thankfully, but I can only guess that if this is what they're saying, that they're just not very serious people.
Well, no. We can certainly work that out. I mean, it is a typical sort of leftist, mid intelligence, Guardian reader kind of habit where they get some information on a subject and then use the bits of it that they like to bolster their worldview and then kind of throw the rest of it out. But we know that about them. We know that about them, really.
Well, that's where that's the bread and butter of universalist paganism.
Yep, pretty much. Like, I really like the Norse ones who pick up on the fact that Thor, in one of the myths, wore a dress as a disguise to get his hammer back once. Bearing in mind that all of these myths are kind of metaphorical and not really supposed to be read literally anyway. Oh, and Loki turned into a female horse once. So, non-binary people are valid.
Yeah,
Despite
that's
the
the
fact that Loki's not good.
that's the origin of it all. The gods told us.
Well, I mean, these
Yeah.
kind of like cherry picking things are. This is the sort of like heuristic of the left, right? Like
Yeah.
the left is all about considering the marginal case over, what is normal. So it makes a lot of sense that this is the kind of reasoning that they would engage in if they had only listened to Aristotle when he said "Osepi topuli," which is something like "on the whole" or "in general." You need to consider, what does the shape of the myths look like in general. I mean, sure, you can always find a kind of edge case that's going to allow you to prove anything, but like, I mean, if you kind of took that seriously and really generalized that idea, that you can just kind of take a single case and extrapolate from that. If you took that seriously enough, you wouldn't be able to get out of bed or cross the street or tie your shoes in the morning, because everything would just be this sort of like exceptional,
Mhm.
unprecedented case. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I
I,
was.
I just find these people absurd, really.
Yeah, they are. I was looking into wolf as a symbol the other day, and one source I came over looking at it more as an animal guide. It linked it with freedom, but also said that you gain freedom through discipline and hierarchy. The author of that book is dead now. I don't know what political leanings he himself had, but that is something that is totally forgotten these days. But you find it in the old stories. Being free isn't doing whatever you want to do, basically being a child. You gain freedom by cultivating yourself, growing as a person, becoming an adult, and that includes discipline. So linking that to the leftist, the dabbling in folklore and everything, when they have to do those mental gymnastics, I think they, at least some of them, might be running from themselves in many ways. Maybe all of the tales stir something very deep inside them and they can't handle it, so they run away, and linking it all up to all and sundry of woke fixed ideas that has come up at the spur of the moment or something. But by regaining that, we can definitely create a strong foundation to work from. So I'm really happy to hear that the book has been a success so far, and I hope it will continue to sell very well. It's definitely very heartening to me to hear.
Yeah, I'm surprised actually at how well it has done. Because I mean, well, I knew it would do well because people have been clamoring for it for years now. People have been asking for it because what we did was originally when we kind of launched the company is we put, coming soon. When we launched in 2019, we're like coming early 2020. Folktales in the Indo-European Tradition. We were pretty naive about release schedules at that time, but we
Yeah.
kind of let people know that these things were coming. And a lot of people saw, oh, what's this crazy folktales book coming out? And so, we've been having a lot of interest coming our way about it. And so I knew that when it came out, it was going to do well, but it did better than I expected. So that was really interesting. That was really encouraging. But what I found interesting, and I don't know, I'll throw this to you guys, and you can tell me what you think about this and what it means, because I'm not sure. I've been thinking about it. What I've found is that the Folktales book has done much better proportionally with Europeans, people like living in Europe, as opposed to Americans and Canadians and other parts of the Anglosphere. It's done very well in Europe and the UK. Compared to what most of our releases do. I mean, our releases do like modestly well in these countries, but the Folktales book far and away did better. So I don't know, what does that mean? What do you?
Hmm.
I can't figure it out.
I think I can probably take this for the UK. So the difference I see between America and the UK is America's got much more of a sense of its own identity as America. So it's got patriotism. Patriotism is kind of allowed to happen there. There are American traditions. There is American folklore that America does have. Stories from the pioneer days, stories of the Wild West. It's kind of been apart long enough to develop its own folklore and integrate aspects of native folklore as well. And I don't know if the same thing has maybe happened with Australia and places like that. But in Britain and Europe, we are, well, particularly in Britain, you have to be self-depreciating about Britain. You always have to be self-depreciating about Britain. It's like kind of a rule that it's tacky to be unironically patriotic. And
It's the same thing with
therefore,
Canadians.
yeah.
I hate it, but yes, we're the same way.
Yeah. So it's quite a lot of the time the way where it's really tacky to be unironically patriotic, or to say actual good things about Britain instead of, oh yeah, it's a rainy, damp, grey rock, but we love it type of patriotism. So I think particularly in Britain, particularly in England has totally lost most of its connection to its folk culture. Like the forms of English folk dancing, Morris dancing and English country dancing, they've almost completely stopped. English indigenous dialects and languages like Yorkshire dialects and Cornish dialects, they've almost completely died out. It's been homogenized. And therefore, if you're getting a lot of orders from the UK, I suspect probably most of them are going to be coming from England, I would guess, because I think that's the place that's lost touch with its roots the most. And of course, certain European countries are not allowed to feel patriotic because they participated in colonialism, or they won a war they weren't supposed to. And the newer countries, some of the newer countries, like Australia, for example, I guess, don't have as much of that baggage. Also, I think we're becoming very conscious of our roots because we live usually in so much closer proximity with each other. Especially in Britain, we're all squished together geographically, spatially. So you might have, say, a lot of different ethnicities in America, but I've imagined they've all got space to separate out into their own enclaves. Whereas in Britain and Europe, we tend to have smaller living spaces. So I think you're very forced to interact and become conscious that you're different from other people, and see other people going about and practicing their cultures, like, oh, look, they've got Eid and they've got this whole story behind Diwali. What have I got? What's my culture? Because you're running up into different cultures every day in the smaller space that you're in. If that makes
Yeah.
sense.
It does, actually. I think it kind of jives a bit with sort of where I was leaning with like my explanation of it. Especially it resonates the part about being unable to be unironically patriotic. Because I have noticed that I'd have to check, like within the UK, I'd have to check, the numbers to see like where they're going, where these books are like proportionally going in the UK. But I think probably that's right, is that they're going more to England proportionally than we'd usually see. Um, and the one country that has, like doubled or tripled or quadrupled its intake of our books is Germany. Uh, and I wouldn't have expected that because, of course, they don't speak English, and I mean, I'm sure a lot of people in Germany do speak English,
Mm.
but it's not their native tongue, and yet it's selling very well there compared to some of our other titles. So I think that's probably right on the money.
That's not surprising to me. They have the sort of same guilt burden on their patriotism as Britain does. We have to keep apologizing. Yeah, a lot more.
Yeah.
A lot more. It's bad enough for us having to constantly apologize for the empire. And the Germans have been drummed into thinking that being patriotic to their own country is bad for so long.
Yeah, being patriotic and nationalistic and everything, it's literally being a genocider. So, of course, that would be very difficult. And I'm really glad to hear how that is growing in Germany. When it comes to the difference between Europe and our seedling states, as I call them, when it comes to the US, I think it's because so much of their own national identity is their break with Europe, breaking free and everything. So that sort of creates a fresh start, you could say. Maybe a little less inclined to look into the folklore and everything, though there was a period with a lot of people coming to Europe to look up their roots. Having done genealogical research and everything and visiting the areas where their ancestor came from. I've met quite a few of them, actually. It's really not surprising that England has the biggest or the UK has the biggest numbers because of the language thing. I would think many are more inclined to look at folk tales in their native language. Norway is in a bit of a schizophrenic state when it comes to that. I don't know how else to put it, because our identity, which is basically the myth of Norway, is our breaking free of Denmark and Sweden, re-establishing our independence and everything, and sort of, how to put it, one thing we're saying about ourselves is how we're different, pointing out how different we are compared to other Europeans and everything. Even saying that Norway is the different country as a more or less of a title. But after mass immigration and everything started, then they came up with a bit of a problem, when our identity is so rooted in our ancestors. So then it's basically just, everyone can become Norwegian, but that folkloric strain is still very strong in many ways. Even just a couple of years ago or so, I saw they were making another audiobook version of our Folktales. It's still very much part of growing up in daycare and school for the kids, which I definitely like. The folk aspect in music has definitely had a revival over the last 20 years or so, and it has gained some ground internationally. We have it in English and in Norwegian. One of the largest bands 20 years ago was a band called Gåte, that translates into riddle, and they literally took old folk songs, collected hundreds of years ago, and put them to contemporary rock music, and they were really huge. So you do see that it's still there, and looking a bit more internationally, even when you come to more Hollywood and everything, look at the show Vikings. Despite all of the mistakes that's in there, when you see the popularity it gained, I think you can see how much of a need people of European descent, no matter where they are, need to connect to who they are, need to connect to their history, their ancestors and everything. So it's not dead at all, and we can build on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think in mainland Europe and Britain, this stuff is a way of rebelling, because I think we have definitely more restrictions upon us in the way of speech than America and places like that. And when we have folklore and folk culture and we invest ourselves in them and we say we love these things, that is a safe patriotism for us. That is a safe way of saying we are worth something, because you can try and cancel a person for saying that they love European folk stories or they love English folk dancing, but it's not really going to work. You know what I mean? So I guess it is a way of rebelling when we're told not to be attached to our cultures.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, actually, and this is why, in a place like Germany that's so hamstrung by political correctness, that the book is done well proportionally there compared to some of the other books that we put out. I think it's because, I mean, none of the folk tales in there are all that spicy. On the outside, there was some that for inclusion that we were considering that were a little bit spicy, but we decided to go with others in the end. And I think that this is very true. Is that in a place like that, that folk tales and folk culture and endorsing that and kind of is a way of taking your own side without falling afoul of any hate speech laws or anything like that. But it's also it's not just kind of like trivial, listening to the wind or anything like that. It really is very much it's a very strong way of fighting back, because you're kind of like you're watering the soil that generates all of these wonderful things that, like the romantic nationalist movement, and like all the things that came later, and of which we are one of the heirs. This is a way of uh, sort of fertilizing that, and making sure that future generations will be able to kind of pick up on it. So, I'm really glad we put it out, because I mean, it did better than I expected, but it had an effect that I didn't expect as well. And I'm sort of, an implicit effect that I have to infer here, but I think you guys have picked up on it. And I agree that this is part of why it's done as well as it has, is that it's had these effects. It's basically allowed people to reconnect with those roots in a way that's very deep and abiding here. So, um, very much worth it. And those um, hundreds of hours of work that I mentioned earlier were well
Mm.
spent, I think.
Yeah. And we were going to actually talk about some of those hundreds of hours of work, because one of the questions that we also had for you was, how did you go about the research for this? I mean, you obviously used the Arne Thompson Uther Index, and you explained that quite well in your foreword. But yeah, some of these stories, they were difficult to get a hold of, as you said. Like, do you have a large team to help you do research at Imperium Press,
Well,
or
I
has it
mean, we
just
do
been
we
it's
do
been
have a
you
team
mostly?
now.
Yeah.
Back in 2017, when I was just, it was just a twinkle in my eye, Imperium Press. I didn't have a team; it was just me, and that's when a lot of the legwork was done. I would say that probably about 2/3 of the work was done, back a year before we ever put anything out. So, for the most part, it was just myself sitting there and just putting in the time. Um, and I kind of, I pretty much learned as I went, right? Like, I had a background in European myth, from my own readings and everything like that. I'd read quite a few folk tales, because it's just something I've been interested in since I was a child. But I was always fascinated by these things, right? The traditional stories. Like when I was a kid, I remember my dad reading me this book, and it was this picture book of like Greek and Germanic and other European myths and legends and whatnot. And then as I grew up, I kind of forgot about it, and I got interested in like normal teenager things and whatever. But then like later on, I started having these like flashback memories, like sitting on the bed with my mom and dad reading me this book, like as a very young child. And I just decided that you know, I must have made that up, and that invented this book in my head or whatever. And then somehow I mentioned it to my dad on the phone one day. And then the next time I saw him, he said, "Hey, son, do you remember that book you were telling me about? Is it this one?" And then he handed me the very book that I had been like flashing through my memories for like years at this point. And I was just stupefied. So, um, these things like
That's
myth and
wonderful.
yeah, it was great actually. I'll always remember that. So like myth and legend and folk tale, these things are like in my blood. So I was really well prepared to put together the book. But in terms of actual like the work of comparativism, and digging into the ATU tale types, um, I mean, there've with quite a few sort of influences on that, I guess. George Dumazil has been a big influence on me, because I'm an Indo-European reconstructivist pagan. He's a philologist, for guys who don't know him.
Mhm.
He's a philologist who's done a lot of work in reconstructing the myths and the worldview of the Indo-Europeans. Um, but yeah, I mean, just basically sort of on a day-to-day basis, what it came down to putting this book together was getting the list from that Silva Tehrani study, and just doing a lot of like Google foo, like just really trying to dig in there and like Googling, well, ATU, you know, 314A. So that would be like the code of one of these tail types. And that they have they have a description as well. So Google the description, and it's like you come up with these um, you come up with these secondary sources that are kind of helpful. Some of them are very helpful, and others are only somewhat helpful. Like I made a lot of use, and I put all this stuff in the bibliography as well. I made a lot of use of a book by a folklorist named D.L. Ashleyman. The book is called Guide to Folktales in the English Language, which basically it's like exactly what I needed. It's just a collection of folk tales translated into English, or collected in English by ATU tale type. And another one by Stith
Nice.
Thompson, which is called The Types of the Folk Tale. Stith the Thompson is the T in ATU. So this guy wrote a book back in the 1960s that it's not quite just a list of folk tales, but what it is it's sort of a discussion and exposition of the tale types, and it kind of explains, okay, well, here's what happens in this type. And we found quite a few of them in Estonia, and then like a bunch in like other Baltic countries, and then there's a few in Russia, and blah 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 blah. Like for each tale type, it gives quite a bit of folkloristic information. That one was really helpful. I won't list all the books that I used. They're all in the bibliography, but it's
Yes.
that kind of thing. I would just go through and look at secondary sources and get what I could get out of them, and then look at the bibliography of those secondary sources, and then find other useful resources, and then
Mm.
repeat the process. Like get those other resources, look in the bibliography. Like that's how you discover texts. Basically, this is how
Yeah.
you discover interesting stuff and kind of get what you need out of that. But it just was a lot of sort of head pounding against the wall, grinding work, just trying to actually get these things. And there were quite a
Mm.
few. I used a lot of the Internet Archive, which archive.org, which is a great resource for
Oh yeah.
everything that we do. And there were many obscure websites, many of which have now disappeared. That I have, because like I said, I did most of it from like 27 to 2018, and then I stopped for like a couple of years. And then when I came back to it, when it was time to kind of get this thing going to print, I couldn't find any of these websites again, right? Because they had been taken off the web. Like we kind of think of the
Yeah.
internet as just this thing that like only grows and like never, like you only add to it and never subtract. That's not really the way it works. There's a
Yeah.
fantastic,
Exactly.
there's a really great Estonian website called folklore.ee. So I mean, we included a handful of Estonian folk tales, and I even commissioned some for original translation for this book. Um, but this website is just very well set up for that. Like you can find a lot of stuff by ATU tale type. It's all in Estonian, so you got to plug it into Google Translate to understand any of it. At least we have that today. So it's this kind of stuff. I'm just kind of giving you some like random snippets of like the kind of day-to-day work that would go into putting something together like this. And of course, I would it would be hard enough to come up with three samples of certain tale types. Some are easy. Beauty and the Beast, no problem. Cinderella, easy. The Thieving Pot, that one was a bit more of a challenge, that kind of thing, right?
Mm.
So I'd have to really do some very tricky googling to try and work out where I can find samples of this stuff, and then I'd have to pay guys to translate it for me in a lot of cases, because one of the selection criteria, number one, is it has to be in the public domain, because otherwise our book's going to get taken down, right? So it all had to be on the up and up as far as that's concerned. So
Mhm.
yeah, it was just a really long slog. It's kind of the TLDR of it, but the end result I'm very proud of. So yeah, it was worth it.
Yeah. Me and Lynx have done that kind of thing as well, sifting through ATU tail indexes, going through whole books on Project Gutenberg, and looking at websites like World of Fairy Tales and narrowing it down to find something which fits the particular theme that we're doing. And of course, sometimes you can't get to various bits of research that you might need to analyze them because they're stuck behind a paywall. And so, yeah, we know how difficult it can be to chase some of these stories down. And so you got 3 of every single type that you picked in this book.
Yeah.
That is very, very impressive.
It sure took a lot of effort to make that happen. Like I say, some of it was easier than others. I'd say it's the old 80-20 rule, right? Like 80% of the book required 20% of the effort, and then the remaining 20% of the book required 80% of the effort. So
yeah. And that's sort of the thing that makes it a good book, that extra effort for the extra 20%. Like that's what really makes it.
But I think also, like, it was kind of good that it took that much time and effort, right? And of course, when you get these folk tales from websites like, Gutenberg's pretty good, actually. They clearly do some editing and proofreading. Archive.org, I praised it as a wonderful resource, which it is, but they just do their OCR, their optical character recognition. Basically, they take an algorithm, they scan a PDF, and it pops it out into text format, and the text is very garbled. So, that's and the thing ended up being 300,000 words. So just to give the audience a bit of perspective, it's about 45% of the length of the Bible, this book. It's very, very long. And all of those, 300,000 words had to be proofread a few times by me and other people. So the bottom line is I've familiarized myself with these folk tales, read them over and over again. I probably read the whole book about 3 or 4 times. And that was, in so doing, what that allowed me to do was gave me a lot of opportunities to notice connections. And, it's interesting because I actually wrote a preface back in 2017. I still have it. And it's not as good as the one that we ended up using, that I ended up rewriting for the introduction here, that got published. But I did, basically from about a year into the beginning of the project, I started taking notes and being like, oh, isn't that interesting? This tale type looks a lot like this myth, or this tale type looks a lot like all these stories in the Poetic Edda. Isn't that crazy? And like all this different stuff. So like, for anyone who's read the introduction, there's a lot of comparative work in there. Basically, what I do in the introduction, in a nutshell, is I show how folk tales can tell us a lot about the Indo-European worldview, and can tell us information that we didn't already have about the myths themselves. Like I was able to trace back a number of the stories in the Poetic Edda to 750 BC by the way of comparative folkloristics. And most of it has been unable to be traced any further back than about 700 AD. So I regard this as a sort of an original contribution to mythological studies, which I suppose it is. But it's only in
that is really cool.
Yeah, I was excited when I found out about this. Right, when I was like, okay, so all these these 3 books or stories in the Poetic Edda, they all answer to these tale types, and it turns out that these tale types, definitively, no question about it, based on the study, these tale types go back to 750 BC or thereabouts. Well, that means that the Poetic Edda is a lot more genuine of a heathen document than we ever thought it was, and many people thought it was quite genuine. This is irrefutable proof of that, at least in the case of those three tales. But we can kind of infer that
Yeah.
more of it is probably also very genuine as well. So, but yeah, basically what I'm saying is that in going through with a fine-tooth comb over all this material over and over, and then making selections and then remaking the selections and doing all of this repetitive and redundant work, kind of allowed me to do all of the comparative work that was required to write that introduction. So it was very I kind of like ended up going and chasing my tail many times over, but in the end what it ended up yielding was I think a good essay on comparative folkloristics. So yeah, I think that was probably worth it.
Yeah,
It is
definitely a good introduction there. And I will admit, it definitely made me want to do some comparison between myth and folklore, folk tales myself, quite extensively. That would definitely be fun and a lot of work. But it's really interesting.
I mean, you were talking about the distinction between myth and folklore and the blurry line between that, and the idea that folklore is a vessel of the secular. But yeah, you can't really call it a vessel of the secular when it links in with religious myths. And so the line between folklore and mythology, I guess, where do you draw that? I wouldn't say myself that there perhaps was one, because in the past you've not really got so much of a distinction between the profane and the sacred. A lot of everyday things were sacralized. There were rituals built into every day. So that's an interesting discussion to have, I think.
Yeah, it certainly. I mean, these things are very much entangled. You can't really separate neatly folktale and myth and legend in any real way. And this gives a lot of hope to the kind of like reconstructionist pagans in outside of the normal sort of what we think of as um, you know the main branches. Like Germanic reconstructionism is doing very well. That's a branch that has been reconstructed quite well, not complete. It's not complete, but it's very it's getting there, right? There's a lot we can reconstruct. Roman reconstruction, there's a ton we can reconstruct there. Greek, not as much as Roman, but still quite a lot. But what about Celtic reconstruction? Well,
Mhm.
not nearly as much there, unfortunately. A lot of it's been lost because
Not nearly, yeah.
we don't really have any Celtic myths, so to speak, right? Like we don't really we've got some fragments of myths from the classical era. Like we've
Well,
got like
the metrical Dinshankus and all that is incredibly confusing.
yeah, that's right. So, but there's not a lot for us to work with there. We've got a lot of legend, so there's that, and that's of course priceless. But it's not myth, is it? Or it's and we got quite a few Celtic folk tales as well. But it would be nice to have a Celtic Iliad or Theogony or Poetic Edda, but we just don't have that, unfortunately. But here's the thing, though. Uh, because myth and folktale and legend are not really all that separable, we can actually see that, you know, I mean, a lot of this Celtic myth, even though it has been sort of infused with Christianity and other influences at a much later date, that it is also preserved very closely, uh, preserved very faithfully some very archaic elements as well. One of the things that I go into in the introduction is the voyage of Bran, which is a Celtic legend whereby, like, to kind of give you the TLDR here, the Voyage of Bran answers very closely to a particular tale type. Can't remember what it's called at the moment, but anyway, it's one of the ones that we have 3 samples of in the Folktales book, and this tale type can be traced back all the way back to the Proto-Indo-European times. So here's a story that has come down to us in the late 700s or something like that AD, but has crossed the boundary of 5,000 years or so, and has come to us very much intact. Uh, the folktale is the faithful animals. Actually, that's the one. The one where they basically take all the grains and then they sort of organize them. And anyway, that's the folktale type, and it comes
Yeah.
from the Proto-Indo-European period. This is remarkable. So actually, I'm sorry, I've got that wrong. It's not the animals. It's a different one. But in any case, it comes down to us very much intact from a very, very distant time period. So this is just to say that folklore can as much be a preservative vessel as myth can for communicating the traditional stories over vast distances of time. So, I think folklore has been criminally underestimated in not only academia, but even amongst people who like it. That they kind of see it as, I really enjoy it, and maybe it's something that they are passionate about, but they don't see it as something that's like high culture, or that could have that like archaic sort of grandeur, when in actuality it does. So this is something that we really have to take seriously. So that's good news for the Celtic branch, and it's good news for all of the branches of Indo-European reconstruction, because folklore has survived very, very well into the modern period, unlike a lot of the myths. There's a lot that we've lost from the Germanic branch. There's things that we've lost from the Italic branches.
Mhm.
There's a lot that we've lost from the Italic branches, everything except for the Romans, basically. And
I mean,
it's very encouraging that we can use folklore to supplement and, in some sense, fill in the gaps of all these things that we've lost.
I know it's very, very vital for the Welsh reconstructionism, the folklore, because basically the Arthurian legends are their sort of Christianized mythology. And so when you go through that, you're getting a lot of information on how to practice the native Welsh faith. So it's already been very vital to the reconstruction of certain traditions. And I think I'm just looking for the place where you did mention Bran in the foreword. I can't quite find it myself right now.
Yeah, I
So
don't
we'll
have
have
the
to-
I don't have the PDF open because I'm desperately trying not to crash my computer. So
Yes.
but yes.
I know how that is.
That is a frequent sort of problem that we have in the past had on this stream.
In particular,
Computers-
whenever we mention the good people, I will not mention
Oh, don't
them.
mention them.
No.
Oh, no, you glitched as you said that.
Uh,
Oh, no. No,
The
we
good
don't
people.
mention them.
no.
The good people.
Apparently, that's fairly common in people who do folkloric stuff. When they mention the good people, something happens, with electronics and everything. So yeah.
Yep. Apparently.
Yeah,
So we'll not
but
talk about them any longer
no.
because they'll crash the stream.
Yeah, which is really sad, really, because there's an Icelandic tale I really want to speak about, but I'm not sure I dare to do it. So yeah.
Maybe another time.
Yeah, but it's really interesting with your point earlier, Katrina, about how rituals were a part of everyday life. When you look at the old Greek goddess Hestia, we know her name. We have a few depictions of her and statues and everything, but we basically don't know anything about her. She was the goddess of the home and hearth. So it seems like the worship of her and her knowledge was so integrated in everyday life for everyone that not much about her was recorded. So today we basically just have the name and a very vague idea of what she represented. She was the oldest sister of the gods. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we don't have much of her mythos. I think there's trying to think here. Oh, that's Roman. But this is a good sort of way to explain the value of comparative work, whether it's comparative mythology or otherwise, because Hestia is cognate both etymologically and functionally with the Roman Vesta. And of course, the
Mhm.
cult of Vesta was very strong and very much integrated into the state cult of Rome, and much is known about that. So we can infer quite a lot about the cult of Hestia. Maybe not so much about the mythos of Hestia, although again we do have a myth of Vesta in the Roman myths. I think it's in Ovid, perhaps, but we can infer quite a bit about the actual cultic praxis of Hestia by comparing it with the cult of Vesta in Rome. And of course, both Vesta and Hestia were the goddess of the hearth. And so this ties in very much with the hearth cult, or the the domestic cult, which was so central to the day-to-day life of Roman and Greek people, as well as all other Indo-European pagans, very much at the heart of Indian praxis as well. Although they didn't have like necessarily a hearth goddess, I think aspects of Agni were probably very much cognate to those. But anyway,
Probably.
yeah. So we have quite a lot that we know about this complex of gods and goddesses, and that we can use these comparative means to reconstruct what these people did. And again, another thing that I went into in the introduction of the Folktales book is that we can use even folk tales to reconstruct some of the domestic cultic praxis. This is sort of like the very
Yes.
last thing that I went into for wrapping up that introduction. The
I believe
folk
the folk tale which you compared to the Voyage of Bran was Friends in Life and Death, which we have actually done on this channel
That's the
Mhm.
one. Yes,
as
you're
well.
right. I'm sorry, and
Sort
I
of
think
journey into the underworld type
as I
of a
was
thing.
remembering it, I misremembered. It doesn't go back to the Proto-Indo-European period. It goes to the Proto-Western Indo-European period. So I mean, but this is still very impressive because
Mhm.
that myth or that legend of the voyage of Bran, uh, it is very much like unchanged. So I mean, it's the aspect of friends in life and death is integral to the voyage of Bran. It's not just something tacked on. It's built into the whole story. So we get this very archaic element that goes back to the last common ancestor. It's basically where all the Europeans branches broke off from the Indian and the Iranian branches. So that's how old this Celtic legend is, or this aspect of the Celtic legend. It goes back to when we had just separated from the Indians. So there you go. I mean, Celtic legend may seem very late and distorted, but not always. In many cases, not so. And of course, there's a wonderful book that's just come out by one of the guys in the Sun Riders. If anybody knows them from Telegram, it's called Taliesin's Map, and this is a really excellent work of comparative mythology that takes
Mm,
Celtic legend and myth and does comparative work to
would recommend.
yes, very. I would highly recommend it. This guy does very good work. So yeah, there's a lot of hope for these branches. I mean, even some of the minor branches, so-called minor branches like the Baltic or the Slavic, of which there's like less survivals than there are Greek and Roman and Germanic and all that. There's a lot that we can use. There's a lot that we can do to reconstruct these things and to sort of tie it back into
Absolutely.
the Vesta Hestia thing. We can use folklore to kind of tell us a little bit about how the domestic cult would have worked for these people going all the way back to the Proto-Indo-European period, and by sort of cross-referencing from Greek myth and what we know about Greek cultic praxis and the folklore, what we get in these folk tales, we can infer some of the basic shape of a ritual that would have been practiced 6,000 years ago. So this is a very exciting development, I think,
Mm,
for people who are trying to reconstruct these things.
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And I would also say that looking into other historical documents that may be found can be a good source as well. For example, on the law book in Norway from about the year 1000 to 1200, it was actually forbidden to do certain things in the graveyard. I think it was in particular on Thursday evenings, which definitely points to some ritual connection to the ancestors that was
Mm.
forbidden when Christianity came in. I'm not sure how we can find what that specifically was or close to it, but tidbits like that is also to be found. So yeah.
Yeah, there are always these little escaped kind of little bits and pieces, a stray phrase in like a legal code that just doesn't fit. It looks too archaic, or like you say, something like a weird sort of prohibition that we don't understand. Maybe in the 1100s in Norway, and then you compare that against something on the Germanic continent. Um, a few centuries earlier, like maybe there's a connection there that we can sort of like use one part to fill in the gap of the other. This is the kind of work this is what reconstruction is all about. And I think that comparative mythology, like what George Dumezil is mostly doing, and a lot of others, trying to reconstruct the mythos, like the mythic narratives of these people. Although this is very interesting and beautiful and grand and impressive, it's not the whole story. You've got to uh, collate that with comparative mythology, comparative law, um, and even comparative ritual, and all of these things, and it sort of starts to put together a much more holistic picture than we thought ever possible. And actually, I will plug the ancient city here. You mentioned that in the beginning, links, that this is a book uh, that is all about that. Like what the author does is he sort of compares a lot of the sort of family structure and between the Greeks and the Romans and the Indians, and he comes up with sort of like this is what the shape of the archaic family looked like back in the Proto-Indo-European times. And then he uses that to explain certain things about the subsequent history of the classical period. Um, but a lot of what he's doing is he's doing things like making linguistic inferences from just like little bits and pieces, like a ritual phrase that the Greeks and Romans didn't understand at the time because it was so old, or a piece of a law code that just kind of didn't fit with the rest of the law because it was so archaic or whatever. He's taking these things and he's using them to infer very convincingly what the primitive primordial the shape of the worldview looked like of these people. So it's about a lot more than reconstructing myths, although that is probably the bulk of it. um, there are many authors that have done this very impressively, and a lot of them in the 19th century that have been completely forgotten now. The Ancient City is one such book that we can use to reconstruct the worldview of these people that were once, so highly regarded in the 19th century. And I think that are really at the sort of core of who we are as a people. They inform everything that came later, the Proto-Indo-Europeans. So we can use quite a few resources. We have a lot of resources at our disposal, and we shouldn't just only look at the myths. So, this is why I focus so strongly on comparative folklore in this book. I thought it was a good opportunity to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. These days, I just found out yesterday that there's an upcoming book very shortly with that's a collection of old songs in Norway from 400 years ago. They've done a deep dive into the old archives, and finding all of the old songs that they can. And that could definitely be interesting to take a look at and see what you find of traces of older stuff in there, if you can understand the language, of course.
I'm sure that there would be a lot, actually.
Yeah, I might actually have to get that one. And I also think it's very interesting that there's still work done on this, including in, so-called official academia. So it's not completely repressed yet. And I think we can learn a lot about looking at how all of these things have survived over the thousands of years and the huge changes that has occurred. Katrina and I were guests on Conversations in the Wind with Nolles and Donald Kent. And then that was a little over a year ago now, and we looked at the Krampus myth. And what really struck me looking into that was how the church had tried to repress it several times, again and again, outlawing the festival and everything, but the people refused to give it up. They just continued. The tradition today might not be the same as it was 1,000 years ago, but it's still there, and the people held on to it because they refused to give it up. And I think that is definitely something to learn today when our cultures are under such enormous attack. It's so important that we give the next generation these stories to have that connection to our people. If they forget for a time, they can come back to it later. That was the case for me. I had a lot of folk tales told to me growing up. And as I grew into a teenager and everything, I, in many ways, went away from it. And by the time I was 20, I felt completely rootless, and a bit of a roundabout way came back to my roots. But when you do have that connection from a child, even if you lose it for a time, it's easier to come back to it, to find your way back to yourself, to your people, to your nation, and all of that. So, yeah, I'm just so glad how well this book has sold. That these stories are still getting published, and people buy them, find them, appreciate them, and everything. So yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating how what you were saying with the Krampus myth, how durable folk culture is, and how it survives very robustly through a lot of top-down pressure and everything. It's we can take heart seeing that, right? And this is one of the things that I mentioned in my essay, is that in some sense, like, folklore and folk culture kind of serves as a kind of permafrost beneath which the changing winds of ideology can't penetrate. So, um, folklore is in some sense a reserve that uh, will never die, and it's kind of like a repository of our deepest and most important values and beliefs and just our folk soul. And so, we have to work to protect that. It's not just going to protect itself. We have to pass it along. But that, this is something that, and this is why we see that the book is doing well in Germany. To kind of go back to what we were saying before about how, I mean, we couldn't sell. I mean, I don't think all of our books would be too appreciated there. But this is one that is relatively, it kind of flies under the radar because it's just a bunch of folk tales, right? Well, I mean, folk tales are pretty based when it comes down to it.
Yeah.
And this is something that is, again, like, it just acts as a kind of layer beneath which all these sort of like insane currents can't get beneath. So yeah, we have to work to preserve that. This is the fire of tradition that we have to keep burning.
Yeah, exactly. I think that is the idea we have of it too, because we called our channel Hearth of Europa. And the idea of that is that folk tales and folk culture are the fire that we keep burning through the winter of our civilization. It is a home in which our people take shelter from all of the madness which is happening outside of it. And that is how we keep steady through what is the collapse of a current world order. And that's kind of how we see it.
Yeah, and also relighting the fire, keeping the flame alive. So maybe we're sort of a Vesta priestesses or something. A bit of the same thing.
Title. But we're hoping to inspire the people who will be that.
Yeah.
We're hoping that, people listen to our stories, they engage with them, they come to know them, they tell them to their own children, and thus we inspire people to start their own domestic cult of stories that are passed down, possibly orally passed down.
Yeah. And, for those busy parents out there, instead of putting your child in front of the TV to babysit, we have playlists with our stories. Most of our stories are on the channel, so you can have them listen to them instead. If you don't have the opportunity to do that yourself.
I think I would like to put together kind of a quite young child friendly one, where most of any of the sort of gore is sort of mostly missing, because some of the old tales differing in age groups, just gonna say.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, actually. because we're all guilty of it. All parents, you need that break, or if you're trying to work from home or do these things, it's very hard um not to plop the kid in front of the TV and just throw on SpongeBob SquarePants or something. But I mean, this is how we get through this winter, right? Like, like in the sort of broadest sense. I mean, like there's so many things that we can do to preserve our heritage, in terms of parenting. Early childhood education really matters. Homeschool your kids if you can, but not everybody can do that, right?
Yeah.
But most kids do have their personalities more or less fixed by about age 6. So you as a parent, and for a lot of that, the kid's home before going to school or even daycare. So, or I mean, or like even kindergarten and things like that. So you as a parent have a lot of power here in the early years. And limiting screen time is one thing that you can do. But I think overall, I mean, that those are particular things. Overall, the broadest strategy is to strengthen the family, because we talk about the hearth as the sort of the hearth fire, the sacred fire that was passed down through the generations, that might have been burning for thousands of years in a family. um, this is the family itself is the bulwark, the ultimate bulwark against the subversion of modern liberalism. At the end of the day, the family needs to be the locus of religious life. So I mean, like, your home should be your church ultimately. This is the Indo-European worldview, kind of in its essence. And this means that family time isn't just fun or special, it's actually sacred, right? This is the basic thrust of the primordial ancestor cult that the later, like, cult of Vesta, uh, was the wider instantiation of. And it's the one that I'm trying to reconstruct as a Indo-European pagan. And this is something that our ancestors very much understood. For them, these folk tales were very, very serious business indeed. They weren't just kind of like silly, well, they weren't at all silly stories, and they weren't even just really ripping yarns. They were uttered with the utmost seriousness within an almost kind of ritualistic framework. And this is where you get like the kind of formalism in the folk tale that you see in ritual as well. Like, tales are framed by a kind of formulaic invocation. When you get once upon a time, and then you get the corresponding closing, and they all lived happily ever after. These are ritual formulaic invocations. So that's all very well and good. What does it mean in concrete terms? Well, at my house, at the end of the day, is always marked by a story for the kids, right? And if you're going to tell a story, if you're going to tell a folk tale, you want to make it an event, right? You want to make it
Yeah.
something special. You want to give it that sort of like ritualistic character. That doesn't mean you have to throw on, a toga and then like do like special ritual steps or whatever. But you can have your own little rituals. You can have your own sort of like, you sit down with a drink, and it's always the same drink, and you always sit in the same couch in the same spot. Mom's over here and dad's over here, and then you're in the same part of the room. These kind of things imbue it with the divine presence, right? That's how these tales were meant to be told. I mean, these are fairy tales, but they're also fiery tales, right? They're meant to be told in the kind of like flickering light of the blazing hearth fire, right? Told by
Yeah.
the head of the household, who is charged with the divine
Mm.
spirit of the ancestors. This is what it was all about in the primordial times, and they were meant to be told authoritatively with a little bit of awe and terror, right? So like when the wolf says, all the better to eat you with, my dear, at the end of Red Riding Hood, or like when the brown man reveals himself at the end of his tale, these things should send a shiver down your spine, right? Like the folk tale is a performance. I guarantee you, as a parent, you don't have to spend hours homeschooling your kid, although you should if you can. But if you just treat this special story time, this family time with your children as a little piece of theater that's invoked, by the spirit of the immortal ancestors, that'll be something that your kids can't get from Netflix. And
Yeah,
the impact of a SpongeBob SquarePants or whatever is gonna pale by comparison to that.
absolutely. We
Mm.
see again and again the attack on parents who read for their children at night, read them to sleep, because it gives an unfair
Really?
advantage. Yeah, yeah. It comes
I haven't
out
heard of.
regularly.
I'm not surprised, but I haven't heard about this. Wow.
I
What?
have seen that so many times. Don't read
Oh.
to your kids at night because it gives them an unfair advantage over other kids who don't have parents who do that.
I think yeah.
I've never seen this in Britain yet.
I saw that literally a week ago or so. I think that was from Britain. I don't remember if it
Wow.
was Britain or Norway, but that comes up regularly, at least in Norway. That's how I learned to read, actually, by my parents reading to me as
Same
a
here.
kid.
Yeah.
I learned to read that way when I was, how old was I? 5, maybe 4 or 5 years old. It was a sacred time for me as a kid.
I mean, what I've seen to try and undermine stories here is attempts to give free government approved books out to children through various schemes. And so they have books in school that they're told to read, or books that they can claim at a particular age
Yeah.
with all government approved content
Yeah.
They have those
sent
here
to you
in
for free. And that's what people who can't afford books get to have.
Yeah. That narrative that you shouldn't read to your kids is definitely angled with a certain demographic who during times of upheaval leave bookstores alone.
Yeah.
Mm.
That just makes me
Um,
angry to hear about that. Like, it's just so absurd. Like the justification for that it must be so strained. Like, don't read to your kids because it'll make them smarter. Like,
yeah.
Jesus. Like,
Oof.
I don't know. I just can't. I
Yeah.
I don't even have words for that. It's just
Yeah.
ridiculous.
For me, it's a natural thing to read to kids when they go to sleep, have that as a nightly ritual. But of course, I can't speak for everyone else. If that is, for some reason or another, difficult for you. Also, when I was growing up, we had pizza every Friday night to a certain thing on TV that became ritualistic. What we see nowadays is often the children taking their dinner and going up to their rooms and their iPads and all of that. We really need to bring back the ritual of eating together. And if it's difficult during the week, you can get that during the weekends, maybe. Have a weekly ritual every Friday, Saturday, and or Sunday, where you are together as a family. You eat together, you tell stories, you read. We really need to get back together, even when you live in the same house. It's been sort of a joke when I've been at home visiting my parents and everything, that everyone sits on their own computer and or phone. Except
Yeah.
me. One time I was threatening to go down to get my own computer since everyone else was staring at their own screens. One time I actually got a book in protest. So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's that this is the world that we live in, right? Like, we're all, again, going back to what we said at the beginning, we're all products of our culture. We're all products of our time and place. And unfortunately, the time and place we live in is not very healthy. So,
No.
that's just what's happening, and you need to make the effort. Eating together shouldn't be that much of an effort, really. I mean, I understand that different people are in different circumstances, but that is the effort that you need to make, because for our ancestors, for our archaic ancestors, the meal was sacred time. This was, it would have been something ritually invoked, where a place would be set at the table for the ancestors, food would be allotted to them, and it would be bound up with the cult of the dead, right? You would probably make the
Mm.
procession to the grave site that was on the property where all your ancestors reposed, going back for generations, and they would be involved in the meal, right? Because basically the family for these people was the corporative unit that is just cannot be separated. It's an unbreakable chain reaching back all the way to the high gods. Like, this is how people viewed their family mealtime,
Mm.
back in the Iron Age and the Bronze Age. And we're not going to get there overnight. I mean,
No.
but it's baby steps, right? You start by eating with your children and talking at dinner, and no phones at the table. It's,
Yeah. I
like,
mean,
it's a cliche, but Rome wasn't built in a day. And it's, the only way that we're going to get out of this is by taking a lot of very small steps and doing them over and over again, ritualistically, so to speak, or at least, you know
mm,
faithfully, and doing them all the time. And that's the only way that we're going to get out of it.
I definitely agree with you there. I think another thing that you use folktales for is to give them a sense of the sacredness of everyday life. So you don't just read them at bedtime, you bring them up when you can. You give them appreciation for the tales that specifically surround their local area, about the tales of things that live in woods. You know, you tell them that the mushroom circle is connected to the good people who are connected to spirits and ancestors. You tell them about the stories of the things that live in the lakes and the ponds and the fields. And you do your best with these stories to make them notice that there is something special about the country and the area around them that they belong to. And that's how you create a family that wants to come back and create that domestic cult and carry it on and continue it.
Absolutely, yeah. It's about making the domus, or the domicile, the household, making it a sacred space, and by extension, the land around it a sacred space. So when we go on a family vacation, we don't just pack up and head out the door. One of the things that we do is we do a ritual to invoke the tutelary spirits of the ancestors to protect the house. And that this is apart from all of our regular sort of daily rituals that we do, kind of thing. And yeah, you have to give you have to make obeisances, and give worship and uh, acknowledgement to the land spirits, and to just raise children in the sort of cultural milieu where you even talk about things like land spirits. They're going to start to sort of think about things in different terms. They're going to start to think about things in terms of, where I live isn't just the same as every other place, right? Like, it's not just sort of like, well, well, we're moving across town. Okay, well, sure, I guess. It would be a very, very serious matter indeed to leave our home. And this is what you want people to feel. You want them to feel that the technical term for it is oikophilia, the love of home, of the familiar. And this is really the kind of, to tie it into a sort of sacred narrative. This is the basic theme of the Odyssey, say, right? Because what's Odysseus doing here? He's not just having adventures. He doesn't want to have adventures. He wants to get home, right? He's been off fighting a war for 10 years. He's had enough. He wants to get home. He wants to get back to his hearth. He wants to make propitiations and pour out libations to the ancestors and get on with his life, right? He even gives up immortality to do this, right? This is the kind of thing that we want our children to. This is the values that we want to inculcate in our kids. And you don't do that by sort of foisting on them a kind of abstract ideology by drilling into them these sort of like philosophical points. You do it by making them love the place they grew up and feel like it's special and feel like it's wondrous and that there are all these spirits alive in it. That's the kind of thing that makes people love where they're from. And when you love where you're from, you have the love of the particular, and the love of the particular extends itself into the love of the folk and into all the things, and the ideology basically takes care of itself, right? So this is the kind of thing that
Exactly.
folk culture can do for us, to give a very practical example.
And I think, it's getting to about a good point to wrap it up there with the real importance of folk culture. It is how you feel connected to your land. It is the start of true nationalism based on love of where you're from and who you are. And so, can we perhaps say a little bit about where people can find this book, what sort of formats they can get it in? Where can they get it for the family heirloom?
Yeah. So you can get it. The best place to get it, if you want to help Imperium Press thrive, is to buy it directly from our website. It's available if you go to the homepage, imperiumpress.org. You will find it right there, smack dab in the middle. It's our latest release. You'll see it come up straight away. And you can get it either in paperback format or in one of two ebook formats. We make it available in EPUB as well as Kindle format. So people who have Kindles can read it on there. And that's the best way to get it. You can also get it on Amazon. It's going to be more expensive because we kind of want to discourage people from buying from Amazon. I know not everybody can, and not everybody's comfortable buying it through our website. Some people really want it to, they feel better getting it on Amazon, and we don't begrudge them that or anything like that. It's a little bit more expensive, but it's not like ridiculously so. So you can get it on Amazon, or if you want to, you can walk into your local bookshop and just ask for it. Just say, I want this book. It's called Folktales in the Indo-European Tradition. And pretty much any major book retailer, any brick and mortar shop will be able to get it from us. So you can order it, and that's a great way to do it. You'll support your local bookseller, right?
Yeah, I
So
do that several times when I don't find the book I want in one of the bookshops around me. I ask them to order it for me because I want to support the local workforce.
absolutely.
And I love bookshops, so.
Me too. Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you walk into your like little mom and pop shop, maybe they can get it. I'm not sure, but you can definitely get it from the major retailers. We have a pretty good distribution system. So anyway, our book is available all our books are available. Very easy to get them online. You can get them at brick and mortar shops as well. And yeah,
Yes.
I think that I think this book is something actually pretty important. So I'm happy to have it get out there. And yeah, that's one of the best ways to support us, just to buy our books.
Yeah,
You heard the man, people. Go force your Waterstones to order based books just to annoy
Yeah.
them.
And who
yeah,
knows, if you order that through them, maybe they'll put it on the shelf, and
yeah.
somebody will come
Maybe.
across it randomly. You never know.
Absolutely. I have posted link in the live, and on YouTube the link is in the description. So if you're interested, go and check the description and you will find it. Yeah, I definitely agree that this is an important book. And as I've said several times now, I'm really glad it's selling well. Those who are listening, please go and buy a copy for yourself. And actually, we have Lord Wolfshield in the chat, and he says he wants to make a short film. He is 2 times winning short film director, so that should be great. But he has for a long time been wanting to do that from a classic European folktale, and he's certain that this book he will find the perfect story for that. So keep your eyes peeled, people.
Nice.
Yeah,
There's 150 of them in the book, so yeah, that's quite a sample size to pull from.
absolutely. Maybe one day we will have the film version of the book.
Maybe. Wait, how would that work? It's a collection of tales. There'd have to be some sort of meta narrative. Interesting.
Either that, or
Interesting.
it'll be a huge magnum opus of hundreds of hours of short films stitched together. You never know. But folktales
Yeah.
actually are ripe for, I think, for turning into films and turning them into animated shorts and things, because especially these folktales, which are what you might call fairy tales, the sort of like the more magical, otherworldly kind of folk tales that we're focused on in the study. I think those would lend themselves very, very, very well to visual media.
Nice.
Yeah.
We will all keep an eye on Lord Wolfshield for that one. We're holding it to you now.
Yeah.
You said it.
I wish I had the skills to make animations or something for folk tales. But alas, I was never really interested in doing art on a screen. But I
Indeed.
definitely hope someone who do have the skill will pick it up and do that, because
Yeah.
with
That would be really.
yeah, absolutely. There's a reason why Disney made it so huge with his animations, and how that has continued, and also why they're now making new versions to occupy our stories. So we have to make our own.
Indeed. So, that is about all we've got time for, folks. And we hope you have a nice rest of your Sunday afternoon or evening, whichever one it is for you. I know we have a number of time zones. But yeah, it's been wonderful to chat with you, Mike. It's been brilliant.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been great.
And-
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's very exciting to be able to talk about something that is happening with folktales, with probably about the biggest publisher on the truly radical right scene. So that's really cool. That is really cool indeed. Thank you very much. And so, good night not good night, good afternoon from my perspective.
Yeah.
I'm so used to saying good night. Good afternoon, folks.
I know.
Have a good evening.
I accidentally put the US time zone in PM because I'm so used to it.
Indeed.
But this time it was AM. So we will start another season a bit later, date to be announced, and hope you have a wonderful Sunday and time until we speak again.
Yes.
So good night, everyone. Bye.
Good afternoon. Bye.